The mountains around Ashwood territory had a way of making people feel small. Thick pine forests climbed up toward gray peaks, and mist sat in the valleys most mornings like it never wanted to leave. It was beautiful, but it was also unforgiving. People who lived here knew that nothing came easy. Not the harvest, not the winters, and not peace. At the center of this land stood an old stone keep, home to the Ashwood Pack. It had stood for generations, its walls patched and repaired so many times that no one could say for certain which stones were original and which were newer additions. Inside those walls lived King Ronan Ashwood, the alpha of the pack, a man who carried the weight of leadership the way other men carried nothing at all. Easily on the outside, but with cracks nobody could see underneath. Ronan had become king young, too young, some said, though never to his face. His father had died suddenly, in a manner the pack still whispered about in low voices when they thought no one was listening. One day there was a king who laughed loudly at dinner and told old hunting stories, and the next day there was a boy standing at a grave, learning that grief and duty had decided to move in together and never leave. That was 6 years ago. Since then, Ronan had built himself into something solid. He spoke less. He smiled even less. His wolf, a massive dark-furred creature named Cade, had once been playful, almost foolish in his energy, running circles around the training yard just because he could. But something had changed in Cade too, after that day. The wolf grew wild in a different way, not foolish anymore, but restless, untamed. He answered to no one, not even fully to Ronan, and that was a problem for a king whose whole authority rested on the idea that he was in complete control of himself. 3 times that month, Cade had broken through the training yard fence. Not to attack anyone, not out of rage, he simply ran, tearing through the mud and past the watchtowers, ignoring every command shouted after him, until he tired himself out somewhere in the woods and came back on his own terms. Each time, the pack elders exchanged worried looks. A king who could not control his own wolf was a king who invited questions about whether he could control anything else. Ronan heard those questions in the silences after council meetings. He never answered them out loud, but he heard them. This particular morning, after a night of hard rain, the training yard had turned into a swamp. Puddles the size of ponds sat in the low points of the field, and the ground squelched with every step. It was in this mess that Cade broke free for the 4th time. He came through the fence like it was made of paper, splinters flying, and thundered into the open yard, kicking up mud in great brown sprays. The 2 guards on duty scrambled back, shouting for backup, but backup wasn't fast enough. Cade wasn't attacking. He was simply moving, fast and huge and completely unwilling to be caught, circling the yard like a storm looking for somewhere to land. That was when Wren Callahan walked in, completely by accident. Wren was not pack royalty. She wasn't even a wolf-born member of the Ashwood Pack in the traditional sense. She had been raised mostly among humans in a town near the base of the mountains before coming to live within packlands to study healing under the old apprentice program. She had no wolf of her own, which made her something of an outsider among people who defined themselves by the animal living inside their skin. But she had steady hands, a sharp memory for herbs and remedies, and absolutely no patience for nonsense, which made her very good at her job and mildly terrifying to everyone who worked with her. She had come to the training yard that morning for one simple reason. A patch of mountain sage grew wild near the eastern fence, and she needed it for a tonic she was preparing for one of the older pack members with joint pain. She was not thinking about kings, wolves, or the general state of pack politics. She was thinking about sage. Then she rounded the fence line and found herself staring at several hundred pounds of panicked, muddy wolf running loose in a flooded training pit. Most people would have run. Frankly, most people did run. The 2 guards were currently standing well back, calling for reinforcements, clearly hoping someone braver would show up soon. Wren, for reasons she could not fully explain even to herself later, did not run. She stood there for a moment, watching Cade thrash through the mud, and something in her chest settled instead of spiking. "Well," she said out loud, to no one in particular, "this is certainly a Tuesday." The guard stared at her like she'd lost her mind. She set down her small woven basket of unpicked sage, very carefully, on a dry patch of ground, because she was not about to let good herbs get ruined over a wolf's bad mood. Then she stepped toward the fence. "Don't," one of the guards said. "Miss Callahan, that's the king's wolf. He's not himself. You can't." "I can absolutely walk toward a mud puddle," Wren said. "I do it every spring. Nobody's stopped me yet." She climbed over the low part of the fence, boots sinking immediately into the wet ground, and started forward. Cade noticed her instantly. Of course he did. A massive wolf in the middle of a rampage does not miss a new person walking calmly into his space. He turned toward her, muscles coiled, breath heaving out invisible clouds in the cool morning air. His eyes, a strange pale gold, fixed on her the way something ancient and untamed studies anything unfamiliar, not as prey exactly, not yet as a threat, but as a question that hadn't been answered. Wren kept walking. Mud pulled at her boots with every step, cold water soaking through the seams almost immediately. "Oh, that's just great," she muttered, feeling the wetness creep up past her ankles. "These were my good boots too." "Well, were." Cade let out a low sound, somewhere between a growl and a warning, and shifted his weight like he might bolt again. "I'm not here to fight you," Wren said, keeping her voice even, the same tone she used on frightened patients who didn't want their wounds cleaned. "I'm here because you broke my favorite shortcut to the sage patch, and now I have to walk all the way around, and frankly, that's rude." The wolf's ears flicked. He didn't understand her words. Not exactly, but he understood tone, and her tone carried no fear in it at all. Just mild, matter-of-fact irritation, the kind you'd use on a badly behaved dog who'd tracked mud through a clean house. She kept moving closer, one slow step after another, until she was close enough that if he lunged, she would have no time at all to get away. She didn't think about that part. Or rather, she thought about it and set it aside, the way she set aside most fears when there was a job in front of her that needed doing. "You know," she said, "everyone up at the keep is terrified of you right now, which, fair, you are enormous and currently the size of a small barn. But I've stitched up grown men who cried over a splinter, so forgive me if I'm not shaking in my boots. Which are ruined, by the way, just so you know." Cade huffed. It might have been annoyance. It might have been something closer to amusement, if wolves could feel amusement, which Wren privately suspected they could, whatever the scholars said. She reached the middle of the flooded pit, mud now up past her knees, and stopped a few feet from him. Close enough to touch, if she stretched out her arm, close enough that every instinct a normal person had would be screaming at her to back away immediately. "All right," she said quietly, "let's not do the running thing anymore. It's cold, it's wet, and frankly you look tired. When's the last time you actually rested instead of just wearing yourself out?" She held out her hand. Not fast, not slow enough to look nervous either. Just steady, palm open, the same way she'd approach any injured animal that had learned the world was dangerous and trusted nothing in it. Cade stared at her hand for a long moment. Steam rose off his fur in the cool air. Somewhere behind them, more guards had arrived, and Ronan himself had just come around the corner of the keep's east wall, drawn by the shouting, his expression already dark with the particular fury of a man expecting the worst. What he saw instead stopped him completely. His wolf, the same wolf who had not bowed his head to another living soul since the day their father died, who fought every handler assigned to calm him, who answered to nothing but his own restless hunger to run, lowered his massive head and pressed it, gently, into the healer apprentice's open palm. The training yard went silent except for the sound of dripping water. Wren, for her part, had no idea she'd just done something historic. She simply exhaled, relieved, and scratched behind the wolf's ear like he was any ordinary dog who'd finally settled down. "There we go," she said softly. "Was that so hard?" Cade made a low sound in his throat, almost a sigh, and to the shock of every guard watching, folded down onto the muddy ground at her feet, still and calm, like the storm inside him had simply run out of wind. That was the moment Ronan finally found his voice. "Get away from him." His tone cracked across the yard like a whip. Wren startled, hand still resting on Cade's head, and turned to see the King of Ashwood standing at the fence line, rain-damp hair pushed back from his face, eyes locked on her with an intensity that had absolutely nothing playful in it. "He's calm," she said, a little defensively, because being shouted at after doing a good deed struck her as deeply unfair. "I don't think he wants to eat me anymore, if that's what you're worried about." "That's not." Ronan stopped himself, jaw tight. So he climbed over the fence with none of her earlier hesitation, boots sinking into the same mud, and crossed the distance between them in long, furious strides. "You do not walk up to a wolf who has broken loose 4 times in 1 month. You do not know what he might have done." "He didn't do anything," Wren pointed out, "except ruin my boots," which, again, rude. Ronan crouched beside his own wolf, checking him over with quick, efficient hands, the kind of movement that came from years of worrying about someone and hiding it under competence. Cade leaned into his king's touch easily enough, but there was something different in the way his body had settled, looser, calmer, in a way it hadn't been in longer than Ronan wanted to admit. "He hasn't done that in months," Ronan said, quietly now, almost to himself. "Not for me." Wren blinked. "Done what?" "Settled." Ronan looked up at her, and for just a moment, the mask of the furious king slipped, and underneath it was something almost lost. "He hasn't let his guard down like that for anyone. Not since my father died." The yard was still quiet enough that his words carried further than he probably meant them to. A few of the guards exchanged glances. This was not a story that was supposed to be talked about openly. The king's grief, the wolf's unraveling, and Ronan seemed to realize, a beat too late, that he'd said it out loud in front of witnesses. His expression hardened again immediately, like a door slamming shut. "Get up," he told Wren, standing and offering no hand to help her, which she noted with mild annoyance. "You shouldn't be out here. This yard isn't safe." "It's a training yard," Wren said, pulling herself up out of the mud with a wet, unglamorous squelch. "I think safety was sort of the goal when someone built it. Not with him unpredictable." Ronan's voice was clipped again, formal, the voice of a king giving orders rather than a man having a conversation. "You'll report to the healer's hall. I'll have someone speak to you about what happened here." "I was picking sage," Wren said, gesturing vaguely toward her basket, still sitting untouched on the dry patch of ground. "I didn't come here to become part of a royal incident." "You're part of one now," Ronan said, and turned, calling for 2 of the guards to help settle Cade and rebuild the broken fence, already moving on to the next problem, already treating the moment like something to be managed and contained rather than understood. Wren watched him go, mud dripping from her sleeves, and felt an irritation that had nothing to do with her boots. "You're welcome, by the way," she called after him. He didn't turn around, but one of the guards, hiding a grin, gave her a small nod on his behalf. The summons came that evening, delivered by a nervous young messenger who clearly didn't want to be the one carrying it. Wren was to appear before the king in the smaller council chamber, not the full court, but enough of the pack's senior members that it still felt like being marched in front of a jury. She arrived in a clean dress, hair still slightly damp from washing the mud out of it, and found Ronan seated at the head of a long table, flanked by 3 advisors she recognized by reputation more than acquaintance. The eldest of them, a stern woman named Advisor Hale, was already speaking when Wren walked in, her voice carrying the particular disapproval of someone who had been unhappy about something for several hours already. And regardless of the outcome, the fact remains that an unbonded human-raised apprentice walked directly into an active containment situation involving the Alpha's own wolf. If word spreads that our king's beast can be approached by any passerby with a basket of herbs, it undermines the very authority this pack depends on. "With respect," Wren said, stepping fully into the room, "the passerby with a basket of herbs is standing right here, and she'd like to point out that nobody else in that yard was doing anything except standing back and hoping the problem solved itself." Advisor Hale's mouth thinned into a hard line. "This is exactly the kind of disrespect I was referring to, Your Grace." Ronan hadn't said anything yet. He sat with his hands folded on the table, watching Wren with an expression she couldn't quite read, Not the fury of the training yard, but not warmth either. Something more careful, guarded. She calmed him, Ronan said finally, cutting through Hale's continued objections. No one else has managed that in weeks. Which is precisely the concern, Hale pressed. If the wolf answers to a stranger before he answers to his own king's authority in front of witnesses, it raises questions about what? Ronan's voice was quiet, but it had an edge that made even Hale stop talking. About whether I can control my own wolf. Say it plainly if that's what you mean. Nobody said it plainly. The silence in the room did the saying instead. Ren, who had never been particularly good at reading a room and deciding to stay quiet in it, spoke up anyway. For what it's worth, I don't think it's about control at all. I think that wolf's been carrying something heavy for a long time, and nobody's asked him to put it down. I just happened to be standing there when he decided to. The room went very still. Advisor Hale looked like she wanted to say several things and had decided against all of them. Ronan simply looked at Ren, and something in his face shifted, not quite softening, but noticing her in a different way than before, the way you notice a person who says the true thing everyone else has been too careful to say. You're not being punished, he said eventually, his voice quieter now, more like the man in the mud and less like the king at the head of the table. But I'd ask that you not go near the training yard again without someone accompanying you. Not because you did anything wrong, because I don't yet understand what happened out there, and I don't like not understanding things that involve my own wolf. That's fair, Ren admitted, though for the record, I'd like it noted that my basket of sage is still sitting in a mud puddle, ruined, and nobody has apologized for that. A faint sound escaped Ronan, not quite a laugh, but close enough to one that Advisor Hale's eyebrows rose in visible surprise. It seemed to be the first time in a long while anyone had heard something like humor come out of their king. I'll have someone replace your basket, Ronan said. And the boots. And the boots. Excellent. In that case, I forgive the entire mud incident. Ren gave a small, satisfied nod, as though the matter of pack stability and royal authority had been settled by a fair trade of household goods, and turned to leave, feeling several sets of eyes follow her out of the room. She expected that to be the end of it. A strange morning, a strange meeting, a story she'd tell over dinner someday about the time she accidentally calmed the king's wild wolf in a swamp of a training yard. She did not expect to find Cade waiting outside the healer's hall 3 mornings later. He wasn't loose, not exactly. A length of rope trailed from his collar, clearly having slipped whatever hold his handler had on him, and he sat calmly on the stone steps like he'd simply decided this was where he wanted to be. When Ren stepped outside to fetch water for the morning's remedies, she nearly walked straight into him. "Oh," she said, freezing mid-step. "Hello again." Cade's tail thumped once against the stone. "You're supposed to be at the keep," she informed him, as if he could understand or cared. "Or the training yard, or wherever wolves as large as small barns are supposed to be. Not lurking outside the healer's hall, like you're here for an appointment." He tilted his head, ears perked, and made no move to leave. Word reached Ronan within the hour that his wolf had wandered off again, not through any broken fence this time, simply slipping away from his handler during a quiet moment and making a direct, unbothered path toward the healer's hall. By the time Ronan arrived, mildly out of breath from hurrying across the keep grounds, he found Cade lying comfortably in the small garden behind the hall, and Ren sitting cross-legged beside him, sorting dried herbs into labeled jars, while occasionally scratching behind his ear without even looking at him. "He just showed up," Ren said, before Ronan could ask. "I didn't invite him, though I will say he's much better company than most people. Doesn't talk back, doesn't complain about the smell of crushed valerian root." Ronan stood at the garden gate for a long moment, just watching. His wolf, curled loosely in the morning sun, looked more at peace than he had in longer than Ronan could easily remember. It struck something uncomfortable in his chest, watching it, a mixture of relief and a feeling he didn't have a ready name for, something close to jealousy, though jealous of what, exactly, he wasn't prepared to examine. "He hasn't done this before," Ronan said, wandered off calmly. "Usually there's a fight involved." "Maybe he's tired of fighting," Ren said simply, not looking up from her jars. That tends to happen, eventually, even to the wild ones. Ronan didn't answer right away. He stepped into the garden, the gate creaking softly behind him, and lowered himself onto the low stone bench across from her, close enough that Cade's tail brushed against his boot. "You said something, in the council chamber," he said finally, "about him carrying something heavy. What did you mean?" Ren considered the question, turning a jar over in her hands before setting it aside. "I don't know your wolf the way you do, obviously. But animals, even the big scary ones, they carry what their person is carrying. If you've spent 6 years holding everything together so tightly that nobody can see the cracks, don't you think some part of that has to come out somewhere?" She glanced at him, not unkindly. "Maybe it's coming out through him, because you won't let it come out through you." It was not the kind of thing people said to a king. Advisor Hale certainly wouldn't have said it. Not directly, not without 3 layers of careful diplomatic phrasing wrapped around it first. But Ren said it plainly, the way she said most things, and Ronan found himself with no immediate defense against it, because some part of him suspected she was right. "You don't know anything about what I carry," he said, but there was no real heat in it. It came out tired instead. "No," Ren agreed. "I don't, but I know what carrying too much looks like on a person, even when they've gotten very good at hiding it. And I know what it looks like on the animal that lives inside them, when the person's too stubborn to put any of it down." Cade shifted, resting his large head against Ronan's knee, and for a moment, the King of Ashwood simply sat there, in a small garden full of drying herbs, and let his wolf lean on him instead of the other way around. Over the following weeks, Cade's visits to the healer's hall became less of an incident and more of a routine, though nobody quite decided to call it that out loud. He'd slip away from training most mornings and make his way to the small garden, where Ren worked through her hours of drying, grinding, and mixing, talking to him the whole time about nothing in particular, which herbs cured what, which pack members complained the loudest about the smallest injuries, which mountain trails had the best berries this time of year. Ronan started coming too. At first it was simply to retrieve his wolf, a task that felt increasingly unnecessary, given that Cade showed no interest in leaving until he was good and ready. But the retrievals stretched longer each time, Ronan lingering at the garden gate, then on the bench, then eventually helping Ren sort herbs himself, clumsily at first, then with the same careful precision he brought to everything else. "You're doing that wrong," Ren told him one afternoon, watching him bundle a handful of dried lavender with far too much force. "It's not firewood, gentle. I'm being gentle. You're strangling it." Ronan looked down at the slightly crushed bundle in his hands, and after a moment, allowed himself something close to a smile. "In my defense, nobody has ever called me gentle before. I wasn't sure I had it in me." "Well, apparently you don't. When it comes to lavender," Ren said, taking the bundle from him and retying it herself with quick, practiced fingers. "But you managed it with him." She nodded toward Cade, sprawled contentedly in a patch of sunlight nearby. "So the skill exists somewhere in there. Maybe it just needs practice on things that don't have thorns." "Is that what I have? Thorns?" "Metaphorically, yes. Extensively." She said it lightly, without malice, and Ronan found he didn't mind it the way he might have minded the same words from anyone else at court. It became easier, over those weeks, to talk to her the way he didn't talk to anyone else. Not as a king managing appearances, not as an alpha maintaining authority, but simply as a tired man who had been carrying something heavy for 6 years, and had finally found someone willing to sit next to him while he set some of it down, piece by piece, without demanding he explain every part of it all at once. He told her, eventually, about his father, not the polished version the pack knew, the noble alpha who died protecting his people from a rival pack's ambush, but the messier truth underneath it, the fact that Ronan had been 17 and terrified and had to become a king before he'd finished becoming a person. He told her about the weight of the crown showing up in small ways nobody noticed, how he couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten a meal without thinking about pack finances, how every laugh he allowed himself felt like it was being spent from some limited account he wasn't supposed to draw from too often. Ren listened without trying to fix any of it, which was, he realized slowly, exactly what he needed. She didn't tell him it would be fine. She didn't offer empty comfort. She just sat with him in the quiet after he spoke, letting the words exist in the air instead of rushing to smooth them over, and somehow that did more good than any comfort could have. In turn, she told him about her own life before Ashwood Lands, growing up in a small human town at the base of the mountains, the strange isolation of being a girl who could sense the wolf world at the edges of her senses without ever having one of her own, the years of being told by pack members that she'd never truly belong because she lacked the one thing that defined them all. She'd built her worth instead around being useful, being needed, being the person others came to when they were hurting and didn't know how to say so. Nobody sends for the healer's apprentice unless something's already gone wrong, she said one evening, watching the sun set behind the mountains from the garden bench. So I got good at showing up in the wreckage. I just never expected the wreckage to include an actual king. I resent being called wreckage, Ronan said. You're a very well-dressed piece of wreckage, Ren allowed, but wreckage all the same. He laughed, a real laugh this time, low and a little rusty from disuse, and Cade, lying between them, let out a contented huff, as if he approved of the sound. It couldn't stay simple forever, of course. Word travels fast in a pack this size, and it wasn't long before Advisor Hale and the rest of the council noticed just how often their king's wolf was found in the healer's garden, and just how often the king himself was found there alongside him. The confrontation came on a gray afternoon, in the same council chamber where Ren had first been summoned. This time, though, the tone was different, less about a single incident and more about a pattern the advisors clearly found unacceptable. The council has concerns, Advisor Hale said, standing at the head of the table while Ronan sat, arms crossed, already braced for whatever was coming. About the growing familiarity between yourself and the healer's apprentice. Say what you mean, Hale. I mean that a king's attachments are never private matters, she said bluntly. They shape alliances, expectations, the stability of the entire pack. If it becomes known that the alpha's wolf answers more readily to an unbonded human-raised woman than to his own king's command in public, it will be read as weakness by every rival pack watching us. And if it becomes known that the king himself has grown attached to her beyond simple gratitude, that reading only deepens. She calmed a wolf that 4 trained handlers couldn't control, Ronan said, his voice hard. That's not weakness. That's the only real progress we've made in months. Perception rarely cares about the truth of things, Your Grace. You know this better than anyone. The room was quiet for a moment. Ronan looked at his hands, folded on the table, and thought about the weeks in that small garden. The first real laughter he'd allowed himself in 6 years. The first time Cade had settled without a fight. The first time someone had looked at him and seen a tired man instead of only a king. What exactly is the council proposing? He asked finally. That Miss Callahan be reassigned, Hale said, perhaps to the outer healing posts, where her skills are still valuable, but her proximity to yourself and the training yard is naturally limited. It solves the concern quietly, without any public unpleasantness. It was, Ronan understood, meant to sound reasonable. A quiet reassignment. No accusations, no scandal, just a woman moved somewhere else on a map, out of sight, out of the way of questions the council didn't want asked. He thought of Cade lying calm in the sun for the first time in years. He thought of a ruined pair of boots and a basket of sage sitting forgotten in the mud. He thought of a voice that had never once tried to flatter him, that told him plainly when he was wrong, that had somehow, without ever meaning to, become the steadiest thing in his life since his father died. No, he said. Hale blinked. Your Grace. I said no. He stood, and the weight of the crown in his voice this time carried none of the exhaustion it usually did. It was simply certain. My wolf doesn't bow to weakness, Hale. He never has. If he's finally settled enough to bow his head to someone, it's not because that person is a threat to this pack's stability. It's because she's the only person who's asked either of us to put something down, instead of demanding we carry more. And if rival packs see it as, then let them see a king who is finally steady enough to stop pretending he doesn't need anyone, Ronan said. Because I'm done pretending, Hale. I've been doing it for 6 years, and all it's earned me is a wolf who couldn't stop running and a court that mistakes silence for strength. I'd rather be seen as something real than admired as something hollow." The room stayed quiet after that. Nobody argued further. Whatever else the council thought privately, none of them found the nerve to say it out loud against the certainty in his voice. Wren heard about the council meeting the way most people in the keep heard about anything, through the kitchen staff, who heard it from someone who'd been standing close enough to the chamber doors to catch the raised voices. By the time the story reached her, it had already been exaggerated twice over, but the core of it remained the same. The king had refused to send her away, and he'd done it plainly, in front of the whole council, without hiding behind careful diplomatic language. She found him that evening not in the council chamber or the great hall, but back in the small garden behind the healer's hall, sitting on the low stone bench with Cade's head resting in his lap, staring out at nothing in particular. "I heard you caused a scene," she said, settling down beside him. "I believe the official term Hale used was concerning display of instability," Ronan said, a faint, tired smile pulling at his mouth. "Which is probably fair. I did raise my voice at the entire council. On my behalf, apparently." "On my own behalf, really," Ronan admitted. "You just happened to be the reason I finally said it." Wren was quiet for a moment, watching Cade's tail thump lazily against the stone path. "You didn't have to do that. Fight your whole council over where I get assigned." "I know I didn't have to." He turned to look at her properly then, and there was none of the guarded distance from that first muddy morning left in his eyes. "I wanted to. That felt like an important difference to make, at some point, between what a king has to do and what a man actually wants." "And which one is this?" "This," Ronan said, "is the first thing I've wanted, plainly, without calculating what it cost the pack, in 6 years." He reached over, careful, and took her hand, mud-stained fingers and all, the same hand that had once reached calmly toward his wild, restless wolf, and asked for nothing but a little trust in return. "I'd like to keep wanting it, if that's all right with you." Wren looked down at their joined hands, then up at him, and something in her chest, that same steady settling feeling from the day in the training yard, spread warm through her whole body. "You know my boots are still ruined," she said. "That's a significant unresolved grievance." "I'll replace every pair of boots you own for the rest of your life," Ronan said. "If that's what it takes." "That's a very expensive apology. I'm a king. I can afford it." She laughed then, real and unguarded, and Cade let out a satisfied huff between them, resting easy in the space where a king and a healer's apprentice had, without quite planning it, found their way to each other. The next morning, the training yard was muddy again, the way it always was after rain, puddles pooling in every low corner of the field. Guards passing by expected to find nothing unusual. Cade had been calm for weeks now, training smoothly under Ronan's steady hand. The wildness that once tore through fences settled into something quieter and more sure of itself. What they found instead was their king, sitting directly in the mud at the edge of the training pit, boots and all, next to a woman with dirt on her hands and dried herbs tucked into her apron pockets, both of them laughing at something neither guard could quite make out. Nobody at court had ever seen Ronan Ashwood ruin a good pair of boots on purpose before. But there he was, mud soaking into fine leather he clearly didn't care about anymore, sitting beside the one person who'd taught his wild, unbowed wolf, and, in time, taught him too, that some things were worth kneeling for.